So I reckon you want to know about the role Big Daddy government played in the economy during the Gilded Age. Well, butter my backside and call me a biscuit because that's exactly what this video is about. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. Okay, now I've mentioned this already in several previous videos, but let me remind you that in general, Big Daddy government took a laissez-faire approach to economics during the Gilded Age. And that's a French phrase that literally means leave alone or let alone, which is to say the federal government tended to keep its hands off the national economy during the Gilded Age. And there were several key reasons that the government took that posture, but for now you just need to know that the debate about the role of the federal government in the economy is one that stretches back to the founding of our country. Like, remember that was a main beef between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson with respect to the creation of a national bank. And it reared its head again when debates over Henry Clay's American system erupted in Congress, and they argued fiercely about whether the government ought to sponsor infrastructure improvements like roads and canals. And I could go on, but the point is controversies over the role of government in the economy is not a new thing during this period. But there's a big difference between those examples I just mentioned and the economics during this period. You see, the creation of the national bank and the implementation of the American system policies demonstrate Big Daddy government getting real hands-on with economic policy. But during the Gilded Age, those hands came right off and laissez-faire the crap out of the economy. And if you want to know the 3 ideological reasons behind that change, then I'm about to explain it up real nice for you. But first, let me just say that a laissez-faire, hands-off approach to studying for APUSH is not going to work. And if you need help getting an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May, then you might want to check out my APUSH Heimler review guide, which has everything you need to study as fast as possible. And that link is down in the description. Anyway, the first idea that contributed to laissez-faire economic policies was the growing acceptance in America that hard work necessarily resulted in economic prosperity. For example, I mentioned in a previous video the exceedingly popular novels of Horatio Alger, which contributed to this idea since his characters often rose from rags to riches on account of their own talents and hard work. Additionally, Christian leaders like Baptist pastor Russell Conwell preached exceedingly popular sermons in which he equated building wealth honestly with the preaching of the gospel. And of course, ideas like Conwell's were in direct contradiction to the social gospel movement that was going on at the same time. You see, to Conwell, if a person was poor, that was a clear sign that God was withholding wealth from them on account of their sins. And that was an idea deeply connected to social Darwinism and the gospel of wealth, since by Conwell's reckoning, wealth was a sign that a person was in fact virtuous and poverty was a sign of vice, all of which had a way of justifying poverty in a capitalist economy. But to the adherents of the social gospel, poverty was most often the result of systemic inequalities that the poor were often powerless to overcome. But the hard work always equals prosperity belief was held by most policymakers in the halls of power, and that very much contributed to the laissez-faire approach to economic policy. Therefore, in light of all of that, social and economic mobility was more and more understood by the elite to be a meritocracy. In other words, the best and most resourceful people and businesses would always rise to the top, and that would be the reward for hard work. And that means with such a conviction guiding American thought, wealthy industrialists opposed government intervention in business affairs because it would hinder merit-based success. Okay, and then the second set of ideas that contributed to a laissez-faire approach to economics were the principles of free market economics first articulated by Adam Smith in 1776. So in his book, The Wealth of Nations, Smith argued that nations gain wealth to the degree that they allow the invisible hand of the market, guided by the laws of supply and demand, to organize their economic relationships. In other words, Smith's main formula for economic flourishing was to restrain all outside and artificial influences on the market, most notably the government. Now, as far as ideas go, that one's real nice and all, but there was a big honking problem with applying Smith's ideas to the actual economic reality of Gilded Age America. You see, while Gilded Age politicians and tycoons were spouting off about Adam Smith and the invisible hand, apparently they forgot that the economic environment that they had created was nothing like what Adam Smith envisioned. For example, one vital ingredient for a prosperous economy in Smith's view is competition, but these business leaders had so consolidated power in their respective industries that competition had vanished like a fart in the wind. And so even when a nation's economy took a nosedive and working people were suffering real bad, Smith's prescription was simply to let the market correct itself over time without government intervention. And that was great for the wealthy people since they had plenty of boom to alleviate their suffering. And there's probably no better example of the influence of this kind of thought than President Grover Cleveland's veto of the Texas Seed Bill in 1887. In that year, Texan farmers were suffering terribly as a result of a long drought. And with no grass to graze, something like 85% of their cattle had died, and the farmers on the brink of starvation had eaten much of their seed corn, which meant they had nothing to plant for the next year. And so in response, Congress passed the Texas Seed Bill, which appropriated money for these farmers to buy corn seed for that year's planting. And wow, that's really great. Like, Americans are starving, and a government of the people, by the people, and for the people is reaching out to alleviate that misery. But here comes old laissez-faire President Cleveland to take a dump on such relief. Yeah, Cleveland actually vetoed the Texas Seed Bill because, and I quote, "though the people support the government should not support the people." And don't forget that it was also President Cleveland who used the military to break the Pullman strike, which we talked about in a previous video. So yeah, he was a fun guy. Anyway, thirdly, laissez-faire policies were supported by the growing adherence to the principles of social Darwinism. And I flapped my mouth hole about this in detail in a previous video, so I'll keep it short. Basically, the idea was that if the government propped up weaker Americans and weaker businesses, then it would ultimately hurt the long-term prosperity and flourishing of the American economic system. So if you put all those three big ideas in a pot, then baby, you got a stew going. And that stew tastes like a minimal government intervention in the economy, which allowed industrialists to consolidate metric buttloads of power and wealth. However, it's very important to remember that while industrialists and business leaders argued fiercely against government intervention when it hindered their business practices, they were perfectly happy to accept help from Big Daddy government when it benefited them. For example, big businesses often pushed Congress for protective tariffs that encourage Americans to buy domestic products instead of foreign goods. And don't forget that it was the federal government that granted massive tracts of land to railroad companies, which facilitated the construction of several transcontinental railroads. And like I just mentioned, business leaders also called upon federal troops to break labor strikes as they did in the Pullman strike in 1894. And I could go on, but you get the point. Okay, now there's one other big economic development that you'll need to know for this topic. So the rapid industrialization of the United States sparked fervent desires among foreign policymakers to gain control of foreign markets and natural resources outside the United States. And why was that, says you? Well, says I, because the American manufacturing sector had become so wildly productive, the fear was that current foreign markets, mostly in Europe and Canada, wouldn't be capable of buying all those excess goods being made. And so that meant that Americans needed to look elsewhere, both for new markets and natural resources, and there were three main areas in which they did so. First, policymakers looked to gain control of territories in the Pacific Rim, most notably Hawaii. And if you'll recall from the video on 6.6, big American sugar companies like Castle and Cook rapidly gained control over the islands and the indigenous people who lived there, a process that was kickstarted by American missionaries on the islands. And once the Hawaiian economy became a vital ingredient in the American economy, white Americans led a coup to topple the indigenous government, and in 1898, Congress approved the annexation of Hawaii. Okay, second, policymakers wanted to gain influence in Asia, most notably China. So seeing how missionary activity facilitated the annexation of Hawaii, Congress pressured China to sign the Burlingame Treaty in 1868. Essentially, it allowed American missionaries free access to evangelize in China while also securing a much more open and profitable trade relationship between the two countries by granting the United States what's known as a most favored nation status. Additionally, this treaty opened the U.S. to much more Chinese immigration to America, which made business leaders real happy since they now had a flood of cheap labor and a metric buttload of new Chinese markets for their goods. And to be clear, this was about 15 years before the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, so all those Chinese immigrants would at least have that to look forward to. And finally, policymakers looked to gain influence in Alaska. To that end, in 1867, the Secretary of State William Seward entered negotiations with the Russian government to purchase the Alaskan territory for $7.2 million. And a lot of powerful Americans thought Seward was crazy because Alaska seemed like nothing but a barren, frozen wasteland. But in Seward's mind, Alaska would serve as a strong American launching pad to enter Asian markets. However, in 1896, gold was discovered under its frigid soil, and thus began the rapid American population of Alaska during the Klondike Gold Rush. And that's when Seward looked around and was like, how y'all like me now? Anyway, as a result, Alaska became both an entry to new markets in Asia while also granting the U.S. access to enormous amounts of natural resources like gold and then later, oil. Well, okay, click here to keep watching my other Unit 6 videos, or you can click here to grab my APUSH Heimler review guide, which has everything you need to get an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May. I'm glad you came around, and I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimler out.